Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. Ko ropata Maxwell tēnei e pāhua nei ki a koutou, ko a hau te pauwhaka oranga I te mate urutā ki konei ki te tira hauora ki te awakairangi. In the recent weeks, we were lucky enough alongside Marairoa Marae, Marairoa Medical Centre, to be able to interview one of our whanaunga, Luke McMahon, who is suffering with COVID. He tells us his story, his real story, his raw story about his journey and how the disease has affected him. You will hear three people interviewing Luke. One is Simon Phillips, the CE of the Marairoa Medical Centre, Ben Hutchinson, comms advisor at RPH, and of course myself. Just one little thing I'd like to remind everybody, although I say little, it's big. I'm encouraging you as our people, Māori Pacifica, to please be tested, be vaccinated. As we know, COVID has come into our Greater Wellington region and is affecting our whānau at this very moment. So for now, think about it whānau, the choice is yours, kai a koe te tikanga. But here, I'd like you to listen to Luke's story. Nō reira tēnā koutou, ngā me nākitanga o te wāhi, ngā rokairongi a tātou katoa, pai mārire.
Kia ora, my name is Luke McMahon. I was born and raised in Porirua, so I grew up in Cannons Creek on McKillop Street, and then moved across to Titahi Bay. I went to Porirua East School, Titahi Bay School, Titahi Bay Intermediate and Mana College. And my whole family are mostly based in Porirua. We have a very large family, Cook Island Māori, New Zealand European, and all sorts of people spread across the North Island of New Zealand, Australia, and also in the US. So I've been living in London for the last 6 years, living and working over there, and have recently come home after contracting COVID. And so I came home to spend time with my family. And my mum, dad, sister and niece all live in Rarotonga. So that's where I call home today.
So yeah, Luke, are you able to talk us through that experience of, what was going on for you in London at the time, and what you're doing in terms of life, work, and take us through, what happened when you were told that you had COVID.
Yeah, so I've been based in London, but working in a role that covers all of Europe. So we help New Zealand companies or businesses export products across UK and Europe. So I've been really enjoying that job for 6 years, and I moved over there initially in March 2015. It was the first time I'd ever been to the UK and Europe. I was home last Christmas with my family in Rarotonga, and then I had one of my best friend's weddings in Melbourne. I spent some time with family, my Uncle Simon, Auntie Marama and others there in Melbourne, and then with my parents visiting extended family in New South Wales and Queensland. And when I was saying goodbye to my grandparents, so they live in Porirua, I remember standing on their deck and giving my nana and granddad a hug and sort of saying goodbye. And, I was flying the next day back to the UK, back to work. And sort of quite naively, I said to my grandparents, don't worry about COVID. This is just a big exaggeration. The media are sort of, blowing this out of proportion. Tried to settle any nerves and anxiety that they might have, that they were having around that, and flew back to the UK the next day. And 4 weeks later, I fell sick. I was house sitting at the time. So two of my close friends who I was working with in London, who are also actually from Porirua, they were home visiting their family, and I was looking after their house in London for what was meant to be 4 weeks. It was Friday the 13th of March. I remember that date very clearly. It was a normal day at work, but one of my friends had suggested that afterwards we go up to a pharmacy, which is a very large pharmacy in central London, Piccadilly Circus. And we went in to try buy a few things, painkillers and, those sorts of things, because COVID was starting to really dominate the news in London at the time. I still wasn't necessarily convinced by it. But when I got into the pharmacy, it was quite obvious that people were panic buying. There was nothing left on the shelves. Everything was gone. And the same thing at the supermarket. So after work, making my way back to the house that I was looking after, I stopped in at 2 more supermarkets. And again, the shelves were empty. There was no basic medicines in the pharmacies. Anyway, a relatively normal night, caught up with some friends, did some exercise and went to bed feeling 100% healthy. And then woke that night with, it's hard to describe, but sort of quite intense body aches. So I'd never really felt that before in my life. I'm someone who's usually quite healthy. And it was almost like somebody was standing over me and like whacking me or bashing me with a piece of wood or a baseball bat or something like that. And the pain was, excruciating, but across the whole body. I was in bed for the whole weekend, sort of in and out of sleep and all of that. But for me, there was no guarantee that it was COVID. I still didn't necessarily believe that it was. And of course, the UK was operating as normal at that point. We hadn't gone into lockdown, so I was sick quite early. And on the Monday, I felt fine, so I worked from home that day. And throughout the course of that week, I'd start getting really sick and then recover sort of very quickly, and started feeling all sorts of new symptoms. So quite intense fevers, so really high temperature. Hallucinations was a really strange part of that. I think when your brain gets so hot, starts playing tricks on you. And then it took probably a full 2 weeks before I developed what you'd probably call the full COVID symptoms. So sore throat, dry cough, which turned into really struggling to breathe, lying on the floor and Googling, different ways or different breathing techniques. And because I was on my own, and we had gone into lockdown by this point in the UK, I had to rely on calling for medical advice over the phone. But of course, I couldn't speak. I had no voice. And so I kept getting hung up on every time I was calling for medical advice. But things started sort of getting quite worrying. One night, my heart started racing. I'd never experienced heart palpitations before. And that was at the same time as a really intense fever, body aches, headaches, going really hot and then really cold. And so everything was sort of coming on at once. And that's when I started to get quite worried. And I sent a text message to a friend, and she organised an ambulance to come and essentially check on me. The ambulance took about 8 hours. I remember it was, this was the first wave of people, a lot of people getting hospitalised in the UK and in London especially. And the memory that I have was she had said, you need to make yourself ready to go as soon as they get there. So have a bag packed, in case, and be ready to go. And I was lying sort of down near the front door and asleep essentially. And I woke up to the ambulance officers, bashing the door. And that was quite a strange experience because they were wearing rubbish bags. They didn't have PPE at the time, so they had ripped up rubbish bags all over their bodies to sort of protect themselves, and straight onto oxygen in the ambulance and taken into hospital. And that was kind of where it all kicked off.
Oh, that's pretty intense. Yeah, far out.
Talk about your experience in hospital and some of the people you saw there, Luke. I'm just sort of recalling some of your corridor, from earlier interviews.
Yeah, I think the overarching thing for me that I noticed is, as you're sort of wheeled into hospital, was the number of people spread across waiting rooms, corridors, kind of everywhere, anywhere that there was space, there were sick people coughing really loudly, quite what I describe as a violent cough. People were obviously really sick, and everybody was black. That was the first thing that I noticed, and there were no elderly at all. Anywhere that I could see, there were no elderly. And so prior to going into hospital, everything I'd seen on the BBC and all over the news was COVID only affects elderly people. Kind of don't worry about it, you'll be fine. And that was my approach. I arrogantly and naively thought that because I, was relatively young, fit and healthy, that I'd be fine. when I was put into what they, into the ward, and all the doctors and nurses have, they're covered in all these sort of, as I described, sort of spaceship costumes, all the masks and face shields and full PPE covering them. There was a 7-year-old boy next to me. And so that was already going against everything that I had seen and heard on the news. And of course, if this was quite scary for me, seeing and, hooked up to all these different monitors and tubes, I kept thinking about the 7-year-old boy next to me. And if things were scary for me, doctors and nurses, dressed head to toe with face masks and face shields and full PPE, we're on all sorts of monitors and having all these different tests undertaken. I kept thinking, imagine how scary it is for that 7-year-old boy, and you can't have family members in the hospital. You're isolated, in an infectious ward. And so I was just trying to communicate with him, hand gestures and signals and things like that. But I think that's when everything really hit me about how real it was. Doctors and nurses clearly overworked, really stretched, under-resourced, and just doing whatever they could to keep people breathing, essentially. There was one particular memory which has really stuck with me from hospital, and it was one of my amazing nurses. Her name was Caitlin, and I was having an ECG, so a heart test at the time, and she was, administering that test, and she came back in and she was crying, and it was, selfishly, I thought, oh God, things must be really going pear-shaped, something must be quite wrong with me. And I asked her, was everything okay? And she explained that she'd lost her mum that morning. Her mum had passed away. And of course, she wasn't with her mum or couldn't be with her mum to say goodbye because of the lockdown. But here she was at work at hospital trying to help people like me. And that's when it crystallized quite, how dramatic and intense this circumstance was. She's grieving, yet she can't get any time off work to be with family and friends and do what's needed at a really tough time like that. That really affected me. And, we've become friends and we've stayed in contact since. But there are a lot of those stories which I don't think we've heard here in New Zealand, because we've been relatively well managed with COVID until recently. And it's something that I think New Zealanders are really quite fortunate for, is that we haven't had to go through a lot of that heartache. It's not to say we won't. And the only way we can prevent that, of course, is to get vaccinated and make sure we don't get hospitalised.
So how long was your stint at hospital?
I was in and out of hospital for about 4 months. It was quite a lengthy journey. Other friends and people who I know who had COVID in the UK and Europe was similar. There was never really, of course, some people stay for a really long period of time if they're on a ventilator and other things. Other people, and I was one of those people who didn't want to go to hospital. I was really against the idea of going into hospital. And what became clear, of course, when they discharged me the first time, was that they needed beds. They were running out of space, and they said, oh, you're young, you'll be okay, sort of thing. And so I went back to the house, and what was it? 2 days later, I was back in hospital again, with various other complications. So it was sort of in and out with new things developing, with other sort of impacts on the body. So it was quite a long journey. But of course, there are those who stay in hospital for months. Fortunately, I wasn't one of those people. I was in and out.
So you ended up coming back to New Zealand, Luke. About what stage did you decide to do that, and what did you have to go through to get yourself back?
Yeah, so my family, my parents, my mum, dad, and my sister and my niece, they all live in Rarotonga. And when I first got sick, and when I was first tested positive and diagnosed with COVID, of course, as a parent, you just want to be with your child to help support them. But my parents couldn't leave Rarotonga. They couldn't get out of the country. And even if they could, they wouldn't have been able to get into the UK. So of course, borders were closed or closing. And so I knew, once I was finally cleared to fly, that I wanted to be home with my family. I never got medical clearance to do that. It was quite a ordeal just to, get into the system and have any medical professional sort of give me the necessary tests and clearance to travel. They wouldn't do that. But because I got to know the doctors and nurses, pretty well in the hospital there in London, when they had relaxed rules, so you're allowed to see people in a park from 2 meters distance, with a face mask. We caught up with a few of them, and there was a group of us who had been in hospital who were, so the 7-year-old boy, I caught up with his parents. We had a picnic in the park and sort of just talking and sort of, sharing experiences. But also we met with a few of the doctors and nurses, and one of them said to me that if you're going home, it's time to leave in the next 3 weeks. And I sort of asked why, and they said that all their leave had been cancelled and their rosters had been shared, that they were fully preparing for a second wave of COVID. And so the UK government and the NHS was expecting that all doctors, nurses and medical professionals would need to be back on hand for another sort of wave of the virus. And it was at that point that I just made the decision to book my flight and fly home without medical clearance. Obviously, there's risk attached and associated to that decision, but I felt like it was the right thing to do. I needed to be with my family. And so I flew via Singapore into Auckland. And when I touched down, Auckland was in lockdown at the time. This was August last year. And I got put into MIQ, and I was in a hotel in Auckland, which was great. It was a fantastic experience. We had a really professional team, medical, all the police and army and everyone who were running it were really professional and thorough. They looked after us. But I was doing a walk. You sort of walk in circles around the car park, and then collapsed afterwards, and quite surprising for me, because I used to be quite fit. I used to play basketball and tennis and sort of exercise 6 days a week when I was living in London, and couldn't really figure out what had happened. But the nurses thought, oh, we better get him checked, and so I got put in what they call an isolated transfer vehicle, so full PPE and masks and shields and gloves and all of that, and thought that I was going to see a GP, just for a sort of quick check and all that sort of thing, and ended up in Auckland Hospital for a week. And they put me in the COVID infectious ward, and I was really fortunate to come across a series of immunologist specialists, and they found all sorts of damage to my heart, and they call it COVID scarring of the heart. And so what had happened was the left part of my heart was severely enlarged, and they think that virus had got in and attacked the heart when it was sort of trying to ward off the initial. The main issue that I had in London was my lungs. So I had a lot of inflammation on the lungs, and I trialed, I think, 4 different steroids to try to reduce the lung inflammation. But what we hadn't really checked in London was the other damage to other parts of the body. And so I think I got really lucky, actually, collapsing in MIQ and having that amazing care that, not only those people, but the people in Auckland Hospital took. Without that thorough investigation, we may never have found what was happening to my heart. So I was in hospital for a week, all sorts of tests and various other bits and pieces, and there learning about some of the impacts that COVID had on my body. And then, of course, I had to go back into MIQ and finish my 14 days. And so I was then really fortunate to be able to board my flight. So I got taken in a isolated vehicle to Auckland Airport and had to kind of go through all the back alleys. So I didn't get to check in or, go up the escalator and go through the normal kind of system when you're flying at an airport. I got taken through all these back alley sort of behind the scenes scanners and all that sort of stuff, and then held in a lounge all on my own. And they said to me, oh, that somebody will come and collect you when it's time to board your flight. And I'll never forget it, because I was sitting there and I thought, shit, the flight must be about to take off. I'm in this huge airport sort of lounge with no one around. And I walked up to this desk, I'm in full PPE, face shield and stuff. And I used this phone, this desk phone, to call. And it went through to this, hotline, to this information line, and explained where I was and what was happening. And they'd forgotten about me. And so they had to, because of course the plane was, about to taxi, about to take off. And so they held that. They sent a bus, and I got put on this bus all on my own and then driven. They opened up the back door of the plane, put up the stairs, and then I had to sit. It's quite scary. I've got these photos and videos. It's me, and I don't see anyone else on the flight. It's just me right at the back of this big Air New Zealand plane until we touched down in Rarotonga, which was quite emotional to be arriving home. I remember looking out the window and, the beautiful white sand and the beaches, and knowing that I'd see my family soon. We touched down, and then of course I got off at the airport, and I wasn't allowed to mix or be with my family, so they kept everyone at a distance. I could see them through the windows at the airport. Quite an emotional time. And then put on a bus and taken to quarantine, and had to do another 3 weeks in quarantine when I got there. So yeah, that was quite a full-on experience, and sort of wasn't something that I had prepared myself for, I think, mentally. I had been on my own for 5 months in a flat in London, in and out of hospital, then MIQ for 2 weeks, Auckland Hospital for a week, another 3 weeks on your own. I just don't think humans are designed to be on their own for so long. It took quite an impact on me. I'm quite a social person.
You talk like a little bit there about like some of those complications of COVID. So what's the health situation with you now?
Yeah, it's been a real learning process. I've stuck with one of the specialists at Auckland Hospital who first was looking after me when I got transferred there from MIQ. So his name is Dr. Peter Story, and he's a disease virus expert, essentially. I've been in and out of Auckland Hospital here for the last year, so I was only ever meant to come home for a month. I knew that I'd do the 2 weeks in MIQ, and then I was meant to have 2 weeks at home with my family. It's now been a year, and we've found all sorts of issues. I've had brain issues, lung issues, heart issues, and they've diagnosed long COVID. So I guess that's the first diagnosis, was around a lot of the symptoms that I'm experiencing. Probably the main one for me at the moment is blackout. So I collapse often. I was yesterday morning, had a blackout, woke up, and there were 3 people kind of standing around. Of course, we're in lockdown at the moment in Auckland, so people can't really help you or touch you or pick you up or anything like that. So it's always quite an awkward experience. But what the doctors have said is essentially my heart is now at an irregular rhythm, which is not really abnormal in itself, but the palpitations will be racing, then the heart will slow right down, race again, slow down, and then it will stop. And so I'm not allowed to drive long distances, things like that. It's had a huge impact on me. I can't do any cardio, so I'm not allowed to play basketball or tennis or run, which are things that I love doing. Those are kind of the 3 things, or the 3 sports that I was always, always doing often, which is tough. The other sort of issues which they've diagnosed is chronic fatigue. So some days you literally just can't get out of bed, and that sounds ridiculous. For me, who's someone who's usually quite active, there are days when you just have no energy at all you can't even prepare your breakfast, you can't cook dinner, you essentially just lie down all day and sleep. And that's really tough, especially when you're trying to hold a job, trying to pay the bills, and, need to do all sorts of things like that. Brain fog is probably another one. It's my memory loss is immense. I even for this call, I think how many 6 or 7 reminders, so alarms and reminders, so that I didn't forget that I had this today at 12. And in the past, I used to be extremely punctual, sort of well known for being organised. And now I'm not. I'm really quite slack, which is tough. There's gut issues, so ongoing issues with the gut, and sort of looking at various tests for that. I've had brain scans. I've gone in to sort of try and understand whether the brain is, how would I say, causing the blackouts. Done a range of heart tests and monitoring. So often I wear what they call those heart rate monitors, and it's strapped to me for like 2 weeks at a time, and I have to sort of try walk up a hill, and they understand whether it's the walk that's causing the blackout or if it's something random. Really painful on my lower body. So from my hips down, in the last sort of 2 or 3 months, I've had quite excruciating pain all through my legs. And so now we're looking at potential nerve damage and other bits and pieces. On all sorts of medications to help with various problems. But for me, it's been a real life changer. Dysautonomia is sort of one thing that they've diagnosed, which essentially means your brain isn't sending the right signals to all parts of your body, and so everything's kind of out of whack. And we don't know how long it will take to fix, or if it will get fixed. It's just kind of wait and see, because it's such a new disease. Still trying to understand how it impacts people long term. I've also been diagnosed with PTSD, so there's been quite intense issues with my mental health as well, anxiety, depression, all sorts of issues around sleep. So it sounds crazy because, you have chronic fatigue, but then at night you're lying there wide awake, your heart's racing, you can't sleep. All these sort of things are obviously interlinked. So it's been quite a interesting experience just to learn about how all parts of the body are connected. And if something's not functioning well in the brain or the heart, then everything is kind of not functioning well. Yeah, it's been a tricky journey, but I'm certainly one of the lucky ones. I know many others who obviously haven't been so fortunate, and some of the people that I've met through this experience, whether they were the hospital heroes in London or in Auckland or Rarotonga, and some of the other people here in Auckland who have been diagnosed with long COVID, we share stories and medical notes. We help each other sort of try to get in front of the right physio or the right immunologist. It's been quite an experience to get to know those people as well and hear their stories.
Luke, we've been going about 30 minutes. How are you feeling? How's your energy levels?
Yeah, all good.
Okay. Maybe start wrapping things up?
Yeah. I'm just blown away.
What would be your message, I suppose, to people out there that are maybe on the fence or a bit hesitant about getting vaccinated?
Look, I'll be really honest. There's, when COVID first came around and I didn't believe in COVID, I thought it was an exaggeration, but unfortunately I've learnt the hard way. And, again, I made a mistake in thinking that I, was relatively young, fit and healthy, and that I wouldn't be impacted if I did catch COVID. Again, I was really wrong. My best advice would be to get vaccinated, to give yourself the best chance of staying healthy. My life has changed, and we're not sure if I'll ever get the health back that I once had, and the damage that COVID has, taken on my body, physically, mentally, has been something I never would have experienced, or never expected in my life. So the best thing that anyone can do in New Zealand is to get vaccinated. And while there's a bit of nervousness around, I'd much rather people had a really small needle, put in their arm, versus going through hospitals and having to see what I've seen. It's really troubling, and you don't know how your body and your immune system will respond to COVID if you do catch it. It is in the community, and the only way to protect yourself is to get vaccinated. It's quite concerning. Every day you see the hospital numbers in Auckland and the total case numbers, and the vast majority of people who are put in hospital haven't been vaccinated. That it's a simple truth that people who get most sick from COVID haven't had their jabs. And I'm often asked if the vaccine was available before I got sick, but I've had it, and 200% I would have had the vaccines. It's the one thing that anyone can do to protect not just yourself, but your family, your community, everybody. You know, we won't be able to go back to having normal lives until we hit 90%, and that's Māori, that's Pacific, that's everybody who is more vulnerable. Something that specialists in London and in Auckland have said to me time and time again is that they believe I got so sick from COVID because of my ethnicity. They think that Māori, Pacific Islanders and people of other ethnic groups get COVID worse than New Zealand Europeans or other ethnicities. And so it's really important, having heard that, that we share that and try and encourage, people who are Māori and Pacific to get vaccinated and do it soon. Don't wait. You don't know when a case will pop up in your community, your neighbourhood. So it's really important you get vaccinated and do it really soon.
Wow, perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a really good note to end it on. So yeah, thanks heaps, Luke. That's a huge story, and the way you tell it's really powerful, and I think you've articulated it really nicely. So yeah, thanks so much, and I guess I just want to say all the best for your health. I hope that very soon, or in the months and stuff ahead, we start to learn more and more about long COVID, so it can help you with your health and recovery. Anything
Thank
you
you.
want?
Luke, I'm blown away by what you've shared with us. I thought I knew everything there was to know about COVID, but it's clearly, from what you've shared, I don't know nothing. and the effects that it can have on other. I'm sending you love, light, and blessings, my brother. Wow, I'm so just far out.
Yeah.
Just how it can affect
Thank you.
just overcome with all of that. And hearing your story, honestly, ngā manaki tanga kai runga i a koe hoa, mai rata ki runga i a koe. Shivers.
Thank you.
Oh my God.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you.
No, all good. And if it helps, then it's all worth it. And you just need to look at, as what's today? Yeah, I was back at Auckland Hospital yesterday, and you see the numbers of patients who are admitted unvaccinated, and they're all mostly Pacific Islanders up here at the moment, and that community wasn't protected, so it's what more can we do to protect Māori and Pacific across New Zealand. It's something I'm really passionate about is to encourage our people all across New Zealand to get vaccinated, and it has to happen really soon. We can't wait. We can't afford to delay any longer. Unfortunately, in the UK, where I was living, the government didn't act soon enough, and unfortunately, a lot more people probably got sick because of that. So yeah, it's tough. I've met a few people up here. There was one guy the other day who I met, Jeff. He's this Samoan fella who's been much more affected than I have by COVID and long COVID. We've both signed up to an Auckland University long COVID study, so we're trying to help others understand, the impact long COVID has. And we're in this waiting room about to get our test done, and he brought me to tears because his story was so moving and so powerful. This is a really big. He used to be a rugby player, and hearing the impact it's had on him, but also family and friends who don't believe that COVID exists, and anti-vax family and friends, for him, which is really hard for him to work through. We just have to do everything we can to help people feel more comfortable. Yeah. And thanks for all the hard work you guys are doing, because you guys are at the forefront of actually getting people jabbed. It's incredible the work you're doing.
That's your uncle and his wonderful team at heart.
Yeah. Proud, I know. Yeah.
Amazing.
So thanks again, nephew.
Thank you guys. Yeah, and sorry I talked too much. I probably need to cut half of that. Cut half of it out.
Trust me, y'all ain't editing.
Yeah.
Part 1, 2, 3 and 4.